This is the Sacred Knowing of Is video series, interview number 15 with Tisziji Muñoz. I had some questions for you covering chapters 115 through 120.
Okay.
From chapter 115, the title is, If the Universe is a Vast Prison, then Slavery is a Fact of Life. In what way is the universe a prison?
Well, the universe, as the universe, is not a prison to itself. It's not a prison. It's a reality, a field. From our perspective, it's a vast wilderness. Possibilities high and low, dark and brilliant. So it is not that the universe of itself is a prison, but the universe, as we project it from our ignorance, our suffering and self-fear, self-division, and self-ignorance, yes, is a prison. That means we can get stuck, just like the body and the mind are prisons. Yourself is a prison. We can get stuck at any point along the way in a mind form, for instance, which then becomes a preoccupation and obsession, fixation, or prison. A thought then is a prison. And so to think of the universe as a prison, which from a relative viewpoint, yeah, it could be a prison, but the more immediate prison is us, you. The you and the me and the mine are the real prisons that we have to more or less undo, break free of. How do we do that? See? Because your fears are what create any sense of prison, because there are people in prison who accept this situation and come to terms with their freedom to think and feel and be beyond the walls in their particular prison. I remember hearing many, many years back on my pilgrimage of people who had attained a realization when they went to prison because they were confined. And this was their testimony. Had they not been so confined and experiencing so much pressure to be free, they would not have broken free of the body or their mind. So bondage then, in a certain manner of speaking, is an ideal situation for cooking. See, the impulse of freedom and liberation. See, bringing you to the boiling point where you can explode out of your body, out of your mind, in spirit, so to speak. See, you start to realize that from the pressure of your moment in your situation, see, the confinement of your situation, you start to feel your relationship with the universe. Not so much as a prison, but as a reality, an infinite space, an infinite expanse. And so that's the real universe, it's the infinite expanse, but that's also the real you. As part of that, born of the infinite expanse means that you are the infinite expanse in potential. Certainly not by physical definition, but by consciousness, realization. You can be the universe, beyond the universe. You can be the spiritual universe, say. The universe created out of imagination, and beyond that, say. Created out of transcension and the fire itself. So only one's thinking is the prison, whether that's at the personal level or at the universal level.
Is it possible for people to find true freedom on their own? Or do they need guidance and cooperation from other beings to attain such freedom?
People can find it. They can enter a realization. We can say it's on their own because you are free. Your own, right? Your deeper, true ownness or being is freedom itself. See? Boundless consciousness, intelligence. See? But you have to move through structure and limitation to get to that. We are not often gifted with the opportunity to realize that at birth or just after birth. See? few of us come in with an understanding that we are finite beings in an infinite universe of our infinite, let's say, pleasure. Say, to enjoy, to indulge, and to recreate as we see fit. Yeah. So we don't have too many divine beings coming into this dimension, particularly. So ordinarily we need help. So we are born into a river of blood, say, of limitations and suffering, and, let's say, ignorance. And we have to make our way through that. We have to go step by step and hope that we can unfold level by level and get to a place where we attain a certain degree of happiness. That is real happiness in this sense. Not happiness because it's Christmas and you get presents. And if you don't get presents, you're not happy, you are unhappy. So we're talking about entering a state of real happiness, or entering happiness itself. See? And that's why we need help to get to that place, because we are not ordinarily born with the wherewithal to know how to be happy. See? Because we're programmed to be unhappy. See? To believe that we are limitation, to believe that we are less than the light, we are less than joy, we are less than free, we are less than God conscious or spiritually awakened. We are less than that, infinitely less than that. See, so we have to take on the ignorance that is cultured into us and try to reverse it or transcend it, transform it in some way, so that we start to experience our true worth as spirits, that is self-minds or body minds or humans, but as spirits. And we all need help to do that. Everyone needs help to do that. It depends on what level you are at and what level you are stuck at and what the next level is, because there's always the next level to get to. And you may not be able to make that on your own until you're liberated enough to know that all the levels are at your disposal, at your discretion. All the levels are available to you for your pleasure. Your exploration, your adventure, and your realization.
Also from chapter 115, you write, "There is no absolute freedom to be found anywhere upon the earth or amongst the classes or races of humans. For there is no freedom in form. Not even the isolated hermit enjoys such a freedom unless such a being is enlightened and consciously enjoying the spiritual freedom of beingness itself." How is freedom, as defined by conventional society, different from spiritual freedom?
The most immediate impulse I received from that question is that the societal and conventional freedom all beings are granted, it's really limited. It's a conditional freedom. You're only free if you're able to do this way. So it's a structured freedom. And to step out of or go against the structure of that particular freedom is to violate the structure, and thus, the freedom becomes immediate need for bondage or repercussion and so on. So we're talking about conditional freedom, egoic freedom, and like relational freedom. In all relations, they're more or less created and agreed upon by conditions, see, and about conditions. How to behave, how to speak, how to do, how to be. See, these conditions, relative conditions, self-preserving conditions, and so on. Spiritual freedom, on the other hand, is radical freedom, root freedom, original freedom. And it's not to be wild, particularly, like a wildfire or like a wild human, sort of a maniac, particularly. No, it's the freedom to really know, which is huge. The freedom to know, the freedom to be, and the freedom to love from a whole other place rather than from a materialistic sense of subject, object, high and low, good and bad, and so on. Dualism, duality, and the, let's say, the perpetuation of suffering. But spiritual freedom is something that has to be called a realization of what one really is and who one really is being. Okay? And as spirit, if we can get to spirit or pure radiant consciousness, There are no parameters there. It's infinite freedom. And so for a human being that is fundamentally, originally, naturally, natively, limited to a relative degree, because you got 2 arms. You might think you have 50 arms, but you have 2 arms. You might think you have more legs, but you only have 2 legs to work with. So you have to think of infinity relative to what appear to be your limitations. But the mind itself is not limited to that. So that's the main distinction between a certain form of acknowledgement of freedom based upon being a self, already limited in only that, and a spiritual realization of transcendence, beyond thinking in terms of limitation, beyond feeling in terms of limitation, beyond perceiving in terms of limitation, in terms of knowing beyond limitation, in terms of consciousness beyond limitation, in terms of awareness, potential beyond limitation. And then what do we have? We have a free being in a relatively liberated body, relaxed body, who's capable of being of great service and goodness to other beings. A person that is not in conflict with itself. And this is what good practice is about.
Is it possible for slavery to be used in a way that would be beneficial to spiritual progress?
Slavery?
Yes.
Would you like to clarify that? Are you talking about bondage?
Yes.
Well, bondage is, as I say, necessary. Bondage isn't really bondage. Bondage is just the assumption of a condition. And accepting it is wood for the fire. So bondage is not bondage. Limits are not limits. They're just called these things. They're not really these things. We can make them what they appear to be and freeze them right there and believe them and justify them and rationalize them. And, I guess you might say legitimize them. We can validate appearances and limitations as real. And they may be self-serving, but they're not real. See? They can be seen beyond. We have the intelligence to see beyond everything that appears. See? And be beyond perception. That we are just the isness of the universe. We are the light of the universe. We're being conscious as consciousness here and now. And free to enjoy, what it is. That is consciousness, awakeness, livingness in the moment. And then we're also free because we are root free, we are self-free, then we are able to make everything work. Okay? Everything. So that what appeared to be bondage in the beginning becomes pleasure. Okay? Bondage and pain at one point becomes pleasure and creative fuel in the next moment. Okay? And so it depends on your native disposition towards bondage as reality or bondage as fuel for liberation.
Also from chapter 115 you write, those who do not know they are enslaving others by their thoughts, words, actions, agreements, or commitments are nevertheless guilty and karmically responsible for their slaves, servants, or subjects, just as those who do know that they willfully enslave or harmfully manipulate and control others have twice the negligence and karma to account for. Do most of human beings here on earth play a dual role of slave and slave master?
Would you say the last part of your question?
Do most human beings here on earth play a dual role?
A dual role?
Yes.
I couldn't hear your dual role. Yes. Yes. Now, at what level do they play the dual role? That's really a matter of looking at the individual and see at what level they feel their duality or their hypocrisy is real, valid, and of consequence to them. And now we're talking about a matter of conscience. And if the person is without conscience, then they're going to do whatever they have to do without consideration for others completely. And then it really depends on their situation whether or not their rulership or ownership or control over these beings is really a step up for the beings. That's part of the, I guess you might say, the paradox of this. See? To give someone a function or a role in bondage may be the best thing that's ever happened to them in their lives. The first time they've ever had any kind of control or let's say, workable circumstance where they feel they're doing something good under restrictive conditions. And we also can go even farther away from this point, but on the same wavelength when we see people in regards to a chain gang situation, see, where they are doing time, but sometimes just that simple doing time can erase karma and wake you up, see, like a drum beat. It's not that, but an awakening. In the context of that, like your heart beats, you wake up. So awakening can occur under any conditions. And usually if there's an awakening, it's usually under conditions of bondage, ignorance. Because if you're already awakened, regardless of what you're doing, you have an understanding of what it is. That is no longer self-limiting. No longer something worthy of suffering. So that could be an awakening for some. And that is also a punishment. But we have to then extend this out to others that such punishments are part of the awakening. Part of the recovery of intelligence, conscience, sacred intention, and free action. It's part of it. Everything leads to everything else. And when we're opening up, we start to come back to zero. That we created, and it's all about being here now, regardless of what you have to do. So the truth of beingness owns everyone, but to get to that, enough to make a difference, is really a big question. How and when and where and why do some people get to it now? And some later and some before. That's part of the beauty of this. Who knows? See, who cares? Who goes? Who dares?
What is true beingness?
True beingness is just that. And not only just that, but being free to act. See? Being free to do. Being free to love. Being free to be peace. See? And being free to enjoy grace. Beingness, because it's zero. Beingness. Doesn't particularly mean inaction. It is said that we are speaking of inaction in action and action in inaction. See? So the paradox, doing without doing, and not doing with doing, by doing. So being is being free of conflict and at peace.